my name is Whitney and I work at Columbus Public Library in the Adult Services Department, where I answer reference, genealogy, and local history questions. When you're conducting research, it's important to understand what type of resource you're using. In this video, we'll discuss the differences between primary, secondary, and tertiary sources, and the importance of using all three. Whether a resource is primary, secondary, or tertiary depends on how you're using it. It can be confusing sometimes, so I'm hoping I can help clear some of that up. Primary sources are sources of information that are created at the time in which you're studying, and they are considered to be authoritative. Primary sources can include things like artifacts, interviews, pieces of art, government documents, diaries, speeches, statistical data, some newspaper articles, and even things of all sizes. An example of a primary resource is this Piper J-3L aircraft, also called Cub, which were used in civilian flight training, which led to the Tuskegee Airmen. This picture is part of the George F. Landegger collection of Alabama photographs and was taken by Carol M. Highsmith, just in case you wanted to research further. So, this picture and the plane itself is actually a primary resource. If you kept searching and found writing during the time period when the plane was used, meaning that it was published somewhere between 1940 and 1946, and that writing was both factual and informational, then you probably have another primary resource. These writings can include things like newspaper articles or even an operation manual of the plane. Some of these articles could be considered secondary, but we'll get into that a little later. We're still looking for primary quality resources on the Tuskegee Airmen, and whenever possible, a first-hand account is absolutely great. In a few seconds, you'll hear a snippet from an interview with an actual Tuskegee Airman. The link to the full interview is located on the bottom right of the pictures that will play during the interview.
In my exuberance, knowing that I was segregated and discriminated, I still wanted to fly an airplane. In the 3rd and 4th grades at Newberry School in Detroit, I would cut school and walk to an airfield, grass strip, to help the guys at this airfield with menial tasks. Cleaning, washing, service airplanes, these small airplanes. And that's where I got my first ride in the back seat of a Waco, having fun. If my mother ever knew that I had cut school, she would have turned me upside down and backwards.
That interview was from National Public Radio and was found by doing a simple Google search that looked like this, in quotations, Tuskegee Airmen, first-hand accounts. Now, interview would have worked instead of first-hand accounts, but I particularly was searching for interviews that contained first-hand accounts of experiences of airmen during active service, so first-hand accounts was a better choice of a search term. Another type of primary resource I think beginners tend to forget about is art. I love art, so whenever I find an excuse to use it in a research paper, you bet I'm doing it. You might be wondering what type of historical paper might use art as a resource, but I'd argue it's hard to find one that couldn't. A good example is if you're doing a historical paper on the eruption of Mount Vesuvius and destruction of Pompeii. This piece was found in a home under ash after the eruption, which actually preserved it pretty well. The piece shows Cupid, who is part of Roman mythology, selling items which can suggest that they had a form of currency. There are other pieces found at this location that also showed architecture. So having art made during the time period can indeed prove useful to go along with other research. The link to find more information about the painting and its usefulness is found at the bottom of the slide. Secondary resources are sources of information that offer analysis or interpretation of a primary resource or are persuasive. These can include textbooks, biographies, some newspaper articles, music, art, or literature criticism, and so many more. An example of a secondary resource is this newspaper article published in the National Republican in May of 1882, where William Douglas O'Connor writes a piece defending the work of Walt Whitman. While this piece does contain facts, it is biased and offers an analysis of original primary resources written by Walt Whitman. Often, I've heard claims that all newspaper articles are primary or they're all secondary, but it really does depend on the content of the article and how you're using it. The article published in the Evening Bulletin in March of 1892, which documents the death of the poet Walt Whitman, is a primary resource. It's factual, authoritative, and while obviously the tone of the article is sad, it is unbiased. Tertiary sources are resources that index, abstract, compile, digest, or organizes other sources. Think like dictionaries, encyclopedias, almanacs, and the ever so popular Wikipedia. Wikipedia is frowned upon as a resource by most academics because it can be freely edited by the public. However, Wikipedia is a great tertiary resource to use to find other resources. If you use it this way, you don't even need to cite it in your paper because you're utilizing it sort of like a search engine. Let's say you were assigned a research paper on Angela Merkel and had no idea who she was. Hop over to Wikipedia, do some initial searching, and find out that Angela Merkel was the first female chancellor of Germany, and the first chancellor since the fall of the Berlin Wall to have been raised in the former East Germany. You'll find a database of knowledge right at the top of this page, but if you scroll to the bottom, you can find hundreds of resources. You'll have to evaluate each one, but it really is a great starting point. Generally, I use tertiary resources to lay a groundwork of information or to find other sources like we just did. Tertiary sources are particularly helpful if you don't know anything about your subject to begin with, because it can help you recognize bias and distinguish criticism from facts. So let's summarize. We have primary resources at the top, which are authoritative, original thoughts, or data-driven. Think diaries, interviews, and government documents. Secondary resources are produced because of a primary resource. Secondary resources can be summaries, persuasive information, interpretations, or an analysis of other primary resources. Think things like textbooks or even criticism of literature and music. Tertiary resources organize, index, or compile other resources. Think encyclopedias, dictionaries, and Wikipedia. Hopefully this has cleared up some confusion and will prove useful in your research. Don't forget, if you have any questions or you want to set up a one-on-one appointment for research assistance, call your favorite local library branch. Happy researching!